trick. Look, thank you so much, Attila, and thank you so much for the generous invitation. And obviously, some of you, it's an intimate setting, so I think we can be a little bit informal and make it something of a to and fro discussion. I'm very privileged and thrilled to be amongst you guys, and as many of you would know, I'm new to this scene, if you like, and have been thrust into it, not entirely voluntarily. And it is interesting. I mean, a bit more about my bio. So I'm a psychiatrist. I work in Sydney, private practice in Western Sydney, which I guess you could say is suburban Sydney. It's a strong immigrant area, working class area, but also gentrifying area. I also fly to rural areas. Every once a week I fly to a town called Armidale, which services an area probably several hundred kilometres radius. So Australia, not unlike Canada, is a place not easily serviced from a health system because it's low-density population spread over vast expanses. So as a part of that, you have a phenomena, it's called fly-in, fly-out doctors, where I fly in early in the morning, I see patients all day, and then I come back, and I do that every Wednesday. So I have quite an eclectic practice, and in between that, I often visit jails doing legal reports. I know Paul and I were talking about just modern psychiatry in general, and I chose it partly because you could still be a generalist in the sense that I could have such a wide variety of practice, incorporating, say, prescription of medication, as well as a more psychodynamic, a broader view, if you like, which I think in America is not so easy to do. You tend to have to subspecialise very early in the piece, and we all know the stereotype of the New York kind of slightly Woody Allen / Freudian psychotherapist. You're either that or you're prescribing sort of endlessly antidepressants and what the like. So that's my day job. So I'm also a local politician and I have involvement in the media. In many respects, Canada is like Australia, where we sort of sit in between, I guess, Britain and America. So most systems sit between a British system and an American system. I guess in Canada it's very hard not to be a little overwhelmed by the behemoth, if you like, next door. So things tend to be slightly more American, I suspect. So I've written for some time, usually opinion pieces or books, and I've written on a wide variety of issues, and often things like social issues, be it mental health issues, religious issues. So in some ways one of the interesting, part of my interests really came because I was something of an atheist, or certainly an agnostic, within the Islamic community. And I grew up, I was born in Bangladesh, we migrated to Australia quite young. So I began writing about that, the experience of what I was observing in terms of belief and identity within that community. And we're talking, probably just when my writing career perhaps began, almost a decade ago. So I'm certainly, I'm not foreign to being an outsider or expressing outsider or unpopular views. So I guess within that scene, I've previously been called, the Hersey Ali. And those of you know the Ayaan Hirsi Ali of Australia a long time ago when I've written about these issues. So you can think I'm not a stranger to controversial issues. I mean, Ayaan Hirsi Ali walks around with full-time security in Manhattan, for example. So I've written about a range of issues. So it was a huge surprise to me and why did I even choose this topic? So obviously you're a psychiatrist, but in Australia, domestic violence this year in particular is very much a big deal. It's possibly the biggest deal it's been for a long time. And that's primarily because the Australian of the Year this year was chosen. Often the Australian of the Year is picked with a view to almost highlighting a certain issue. So last year it was an Aboriginal sports player, Adam Goods, and there was a bit of a focus on racism, that sort of thing. So this year was a woman called Rosie Batty, who has an extraordinary personal story, one of real suffering and triumph. And she was a victim of horrific violence and lost a son. Jasmine might correct me on the exact facts, but she lost at least one son. But,
she lost her son.
Yeah, and to the violence of an ex-partner. And horrific story. And she's campaigned for victims for many years, and she's certainly a deserving a winner of the award. So that's really highlighted this issue. And I've had a interest in the issue, for a very long time, partly because of my own community, within the Bangladeshi community, and my own household, if you like. Which I'll come to. So I was a White Ribbon ambassador. I was the face. I was one of five faces of their campaign last year. So you can imagine. So they definitely saw me as one of the critical features to reach out into new and ethnic and emerging communities, where this was certainly a problem, but there was very little discussion around, say, domestic violence in particular. I'd even, several years ago, supported by the government, I'd even expanded the White Ribbon campaign in Pakistan. The Australian government funded their expansion throughout essentially smaller towns, and that was, very eye-opening. Not unlike, I guess we complain about White Ribbon here, but White Ribbon in Pakistan is like you guys here. So talking about male violence towards women is a very sensitive issue. So we'd go, we went to small towns, had seminars, etc., and you'd have, again, similar to here, you'd have people almost walking in sort of slightly sheepishly, kind of going, oh, well, okay, yeah, I'm really interested in the issue, and it's happened to me, etc., and very little, maybe snippets of attention, but not something you could easily gain attention for. So you can imagine my surprise when what I felt was actually a pretty mundane piece of writing. Like, mundane in the sense that I'm not saying it was a bad piece of writing. It felt like I was stating something fairly ordinary and just plain common sense. And most of you in this room would have read it, but effectively I was saying that gender relations have changed dramatically in the last few decades on any available measure, be it employment, be it income, educational levels, so much so that women are increasingly outperforming men on many levels. And that's why I was particularly interested to see this cover just on the way here when I flew from New York to Toronto just a few days ago. So The Economist, a picture of a man, the weaker sex, no jobs, no family, no prospects. And essentially a British establishment magazine. So this idea of marked changes in gender relations is out there. It's being discussed, it's being debated. But it refuses to flow on through this particular issue, interestingly. This particular issue is almost seen beyond these broader obvious changes in masculinity, in gender relations. So my broad point was that 30, 40 years ago, you could have argued that a proportion of male violence definitely had to do with them asserting power with a coercive intent, if you like. We're talking decades ago. And my argument was that increasingly, on all available measures, you couldn't possibly argue that. It's cultural artefact, the idea of male privilege, the idea of entrenched male superiority simply does not hold water. Yet the narrative, if you like, the discussion around domestic violence, and I alluded to what was going on in the public sphere in Australia, was utterly around what I would call radical feminism. And underlying the ideas of radical feminism is male privilege, female victimhood, and male villainy. Those themes are paramount. And they're very much paramount in these discussions around domestic violence. And as part of that, I also argued all these other changes with females in general. They're more likely to have affairs, they're more likely to be the breadwinner, they're more likely to use a screwdriver, as my wife does, for example. And as part of that trend, they're also more likely to commit inter-partner violence. But that obviously was not something that was comfortably accepted. Yet at the time, I definitely felt I was saying something that was kind of bald common sense. So let me just give it a sense of what happened after that, which really introduced me to your world, which I really had no experience of prior. So within a day of it going up, there was huge traffic, certainly on social media in particular. Then I guess the spark was particularly lit by, I guess, Australia's preeminent man-hating writer, if you like. Her name's Clementine Ford. And she's, almost every piece of her just is seething with man-hate, if you like. And she wrote a piece essentially picking out bits of my article and saying that, effectively I made an excuse for male violence against women, which was completely untrue, and that I was essentially blaming women for violence committed against them, that which was a very large stretch from anything I'd said. That set in a whole chain of events, including within 24 hours of that article, a senator in Australia, in the federal parliament, got up and demanded my resignation from White Ribbon. So this is in the country's national parliament. He got up and he said, I'm a White Ribbon ambassador. I've read what Dr. Ahmed said, and he should have to resign. And I remember just sitting at home. I watched a bit of it online, and it just seemed ridiculous to me. And then it kept going on. The Women's Commissioner, I've forgotten what her actual title is. Her name's Liz Broderick, but she's effectively the spokesman, if you like, for women in government in some respects. She came out, and while she wasn't quite as forthright, but she expressed concerns about what I'd written and my involvement in White Ribbon. And this continued to progress. Now, interestingly, my initial discussions with White Ribbon was a bit of a crisis meeting, and they were receiving huge amounts of complaints, primarily through social media again. So part of it's a phenomenon of social media where things get magnified. Now, in and amongst this is when it had become slightly global. So a British website called Inside Men published a bit of a summary of what was going on here, which generated further traffic. Some of you, contacted me and saw what was going on, so it kept magnifying. My initial interaction with White Ribbon was slightly more circumspect. They were sort of like, oh, okay, look, I think we can see what you're trying to say, but it's obviously been misinterpreted. But interestingly, even though they've said that in a meeting, you could tell they're trying to protect themselves, they've sent out a press release saying, we absolutely disagree with what Dr. Ahmed said. He's apologised to us, which was absolute BS. It was a straight out. It was not true. I hadn't apologised for what I'd actually saying in the piece. I apologised that it was misinterpreted very badly, but it was curious that came out after the initial meeting. But I mean, to their credit, they didn't want me to resign initially. They thought, okay, we'll let it pass. But the nature of many of these social media campaigns is that it has to be a head. There has to be a head. It's sort of like a sacrifice. People demand that sort of symbolism in a way. So suddenly, a few days later, on Monday, I get another call saying, "Oh, look, we're getting too much heat. We would ask for your resignation." And in some ways, it wasn't. It's not my lifeblood or something. It's a small, relatively casual part of my life, if you like. So in that respect, it was hardly the end of the world for me. So I was sort of like, okay. But it was still very embarrassing, and it was public. The next day, it was a news item on the ABC News, ABC Radio News, that I had to resign from White Ribbon, and it specifically said, due to his views that male disempowerment might be a factor in domestic violence. And I remember a few people heard it and just thought how astonishing that something relatively, particularly men, lots of men particularly, so there was waves of support there too. Lots of men thought, well, this was particularly fairly bland, ordinary thing to say, particularly people working in mental health, psychologists, social workers. Many of them wrote to me and said, what you said was just common sense, what we observe in our day-to-day work. And they couldn't believe the response that came. Now, what I didn't expect was a host of response from other groups, including academics working in university departments. I got at least 3, and one of them was very detailed, and he doesn't want to be identified. But he's been working in this field for almost 2 decades, and he said you're getting a taste of what he said. He's had lots of difficulty getting attention to these issues, to getting published. He speaks of certain articles where, again, he was just stating fact or pointing out omissions in previous studies which may have had something to do with either female perpetrators or other issues in men beyond male privilege and patriarchy that may have contributed to domestic violence. So he spoke of that in very, it was like, I felt it was like the Stasi or East Germany or something. What's going on? The tone he wrote to me in his emails was very unusual. I thought not something I'd necessarily experienced writing about other issues. And again, something really twigged. I thought there's something very odd about this scene, if you like. What is going on here? So beyond that, also lots of male victims. Certainly lots of male victims who said, a bit like Jazz. I certainly identify listening to Jasmine and some of you who said, I can never speak to this. There's nothing said about this. Thank you. And I'm sorry. Essentially, I'm sorry you had to endure this, but, in spite of that, we thank you very much. So that really, I guess that emboldened me. And even Tilla's invitation, this kind of thing, it did make me feel like, well, actually, again, this was not my issue previously. It was not my issue. It was something I had a peripheral involvement in, but now I see that it's a very important issue and an odd issue in Western discourse, if you like, where it appears evidence and as a scientist you almost have, and again, I know Paul and I had these discussions about Mr. Farrell, obviously, who's one of the, I guess, intellectual leading lights through some of the men's movement. And as a scientist, I think you can fall for this idea that dispassionate, critical thinking will ultimately win the day. But I'm also a politician, albeit at a relatively low level. And if there's one area where the politics is so entrenched, it is this issue. And evidence does not easily find its way up. So that's the most immediate reason I'm here today. But look, I want to give you a bit more background of how I became interested in men, if you like. So one, I guess there's several. One is my personal background, and one is really observing my father. So my father's from a village in Bangladesh. He's probably one of the very few in his family that had any sort of education. He became an actuary, married my mother and migrated to Australia. I was 6 years old. An actuary, for those of you, who knows what an actuary is? Sort of. Yeah, most of you. So they price for insurance companies, so they're essentially high-level statisticians. An interesting aside about my father, only last year he went to London for the first time, where my sister lives currently. And one of the, most of us, if we go along, we might go to Big Ben or a beautiful museum or the Thames. The very first place he visited was a building in King's Cross, which was the Institute of Actuaries. It's a Gothic building. It was about 130 years old. So it's like a pilgrimage for him. And it's quite moving, actually, because Bangladesh became a country in 1971 after a civil war with Pakistan, and it split. But even during that war, he was getting documentation from the London Institute of Actuaries. So it held a kind of special meaning for him. But look, when he migrated, in general, as a family, we functioned well. And my mother got a job. She was a school teacher, but she worked at the tax office, which is basically like the civil service, if you like, here. So immediately there was this, not that there was a change in the gender dynamic, but there was more female autonomy. And that meant a great deal for myself and my sister, because my father was so insecure, coming from deep poverty. He was extremely insecure about the prospect of any spending, especially what he might consider surplus spending. And most of any disposable income he would send back. He would send back to his relatives in Bangladesh. And many people in Toronto. Toronto actually has one of the larger Bangladeshi communities in the world. Many people here would also live similarly. So in some ways, my mother's job allowed my sister and I, just being able to go to the movies, for example, it gave us these sort of options. Now, I just know as a teenager, you could get this sense of my father just starting to get this sense that the world was changing around him. I guess, female autonomy, having a young teenage daughter, suddenly thrust into, I guess, a very liberal, what might be considered sexualised society. Likewise, there's a drop in status from a work point of view. You know, he may have been a CEO of an insurance company in Bangladesh, but there's no way he was going to reach that level in Australia. So you sort of got this sense of him kind of just struggling. And all this has happened within not even a generation. It's a half a generation almost. And I think as a teenager, I don't think I necessarily understood that for him. And I could see him really struggling with it. And as a teenager, I just thought, you know, he's a bit... I don't get him. He seems completely from another world, another land. And it was probably part of me becoming involved in men's issues is really me coming to better understand my father and getting this sense of a man who was utterly entrenched in traditional masculinity, having these enormous changes essentially thrust upon him within barely a generation, within a decade or two, and having to kind of just deal with it. Essentially, the message to him was, get over it, get on with it. And I recognised as an adult, both as a professional, but just with maturity as well, how difficult it must have been for him. And then I saw similar issues, I guess, in other men, particularly from ethnic communities. Now then there's the professional angle. So that's one reason I became interested in just the experience of men. Then, just through being a psychiatrist, one of my early patients, one of my early patients when I qualified as a psychiatrist, was an extraordinary case. It was a young man, 21-year-old, came to me essentially more with sort of depressed mood, struggling to find a job. And when you took a history, you got this sense he fit all the criteria of anorexia, essentially. And I'd never read about it. I'd never read about men with this kind of illness. And then I actually spoke about it. I gave a sort of community talk relating this case and then looking at statistics, and I wrote more about it. Suddenly I realised that within the space of 30 years, there were statistics on men with eating disorders. And in the 80s, something like 1 in 20 of all eating disorders were men, at least from statistics. Suddenly, 30 years later, it was found that 1 in 4 eating disorders, these were sort of US and Australian studies, were men with eating disorders. So this is an extraordinary change. And to me, this was a real symptom of this dramatic upheaval in masculinity, if you like. At the heart of it, and the eating disorders in men, it's very in its infancy. We don't really understand eating disorders in men. Some of it looks like similar to women, others don't. And it can go either way. You can be extremely thin, it can be like bulimia, where you maintain a normal weight, or it can be what's sometimes called manorexia or bigorexia, where people, what they're actually doing is trying to maintain a bodybuilder type persona or outward body image. And this is a real problem in a lot of schools now. I imagine, certainly in Australia, US, and I'm sure in Canada too, where boys are taking supplements, steroids, etc., with a view of trying to look, having sort of big pecs, if you like, looking like a bodybuilder. And really what are these deeper symptoms are really about men trying to work out how to be a man. What are the ways to be a man now? With this upheaval in sort of traditional masculinity. What are the right ways to be a man? What's the role of a man? This, to me, I really got this sense through seeing men with eating disorders initially, that this was a symptom of an enormous upheaval just in the nature of masculinity. And there were lots of boys and men really struggling to come to terms with that. Now, another segment I was seeing was part of this job where I was flying to the country. So I was flying to country towns, and arguably the Australian man living in the country is possibly the last bastion of traditional masculinity in the Western world. It's one of the few. They're very much the old school man. They have their Kubra hat. They'll have a beer after work, after a day's work. They'll say very little. They'll have very little to say, and very much it's this idea of men being utterly self-contained emotionally, that they could just take care of themselves. And in many respects, that was cushioned in the past. It was cushioned, possibly by stronger rural communities, possibly by a less economic turmoil, possibly a range of reasons. I can't say entirely, we don't know for sure. But again, suicide rates in the rural areas in Australia are particularly high. They're amongst the highest. And the most vulnerable group towards suicide in Australia are young men living in the country, living in rural areas. They're the single most vulnerable group. And I know in Canada, even just reading in the Globe and Mail a few days earlier, that men in their 40s and 50s are actually one of the riskiest groups here in Canada. But again, this raised these issues of men kind of grappling with this shift from traditional masculinity, kind of grappling, how am I to be a man in this world? And like with young men in rural areas who are often devoid of opportunity. And it was interesting, we had that discussion earlier about possibly men being disposable or this sort of thing, more than just really questioning, what is my role? What is my role in society? I have limited opportunity. Women increasingly don't really need or want me as a provider. Increasingly, they don't need me to even reproduce. So then, underneath that, it's almost like what is the point of a man? There's a bit of that, particularly in working class, rural, so the most affected, which the Economist article correctly points out, the most affected people in these groups are working class, men in the country, and men from ethnic groups, particularly Asian and Arab groups. And they're all groups, I guess, with a stronger conception of traditional masculinity and perhaps less adaptable. So the writer Hannah Rosen, who wrote one of the most famous essays around this sort of topic a few years ago, she titled it "The End of Men in the Atlantic," which was a global sensation, and later I think did a small book about it too. And she talks about sort of women being a bit more plastic, so being a bit more adaptable, whereas men being like cardboard. And I think there is a bit of that in certainly in these mental health issues. And obviously the other big trend, which goes to the heart of the global economy, is this huge upheaval in manufacturing, where traditional working class jobs, be it working in factories or manual labour, are all being outsourced to other parts of the world with far lower labour costs. And again, that is uniquely affecting working class men. And often for many of them, that's another group I see in my practice. It's very hard for them to retrain and have something to do. And in many respects, it's not a particularly well-acknowledged group. So these are the variety of arenas, I guess, that I came to be interested in men's issues. Another very interesting one is assessing migration claims around domestic violence. Now, I think Canada has a similar law, and certainly Australia does, where if I say, for example, I have an arranged marriage, I bring over a spouse from, say, India. If in that first year the marriage fails, and I can show the government, that it was related to some kind of misdemeanour and commonly domestic violence, then that person I brought over can still maintain, say, a permanent visa. And it's a very quirky scene. So suddenly, now there's certainly a lot of dodgy false claims in this scene as well. And I know in Canada too, Attila was saying, or might have been Paul, where it is becoming a bit of an industry. But the reason I think this was a particularly interesting arena is because it was a great arena that flipped traditional gender power and theories of dominance as well. So often it'd be a man being brought over. There was already a woman who might have lived in Australia for decades. Often she even had another boyfriend. She even had another partner. And it was really a way to appease the family that, hey, I'm getting an arranged marriage. And the guy would come up, he realised he was completely deceived. Then there'd be various pressures. The mother-in-law is a pivotal figure in South Asian marriages, and often she would also be part of the abuse. And then you'd see these men, again, thrust in this extraordinary kind of new world of gender relations. Several of them, and that's why I identify very much with the way Jasmine presented, just breaking down in my room, just saying they couldn't talk about it. They were so embarrassed, ashamed, humiliated. This was the absolute, utter humiliation. And it wasn't socially sanctioned either. It was not really an experience that there were any stories about, or that it's just not part of our culture, our expressed culture, if you like. We don't have myths or idioms or there's nothing out there that sanctions this kind of experience. So the combination with the traditional masculinity that is meant to be self-contained, in combination with this suffering that is utterly not socially sanctioned, creates a real cocktail for despair. And this is really what I was seeing very often in many of these clients, and I continue to see them. Domestic violence claims, showing the gender changes, dramatic gender changes in a very short period. And another critical point, and now I'll specifically talk a bit more about domestic violence. When you look at the studies around domestic violence, dominance in a relationship is a predictor either way. But female dominance is in fact a bigger predictor for domestic violence in a relationship than the other way around. This is confirmed by multiple studies in the meta-analysis, which most of you are familiar with Strauss and Fribert, etc. This comes up very clearly. And the reason I bring that up is, given that we have such a change in gender relations where female dominance is far more common now, and again, I don't necessarily have statistics to prove this, but it makes absolute sense that female perpetrators would be significantly on the increase. I say we all have anecdotal evidence, but this is my point around female dominance and the changes around gender. Almost certainly, this was really one of the key points I wanted to make in my original comment piece that became so controversial. Now, look, I want to speak more specifically about domestic violence. So again, really throughout all this period, I've had more anecdotal evidence around domestic violence. What I observed that it was never about male privilege that I could see. It's a cultural artefact, this idea of male privilege causing it. What I saw was all these other reasons. And in fact, most of the reasons were around why people are violent more generally. It wasn't specifically unique within a family setting. I mean, men are way more violent to other men than they are with women, as a general point. They're way more likely to be violent to men. What I saw was that it was really around mental health issues. It was about them not being able to regulate anger, not being able to communicate distress properly. It was about them possibly around substance abuse. It was about them having a history of trauma. It was about personality disorders, antisocial, where it's difficult to have empathy for others, poor impulse control. A very common one is borderline personality. And again, I hope Attila won't mind me saying so. I certainly haven't met her ex-wife, but she seemed to have all the hallmarks of borderline personality. And borderline personality is really about, its history of it is, it's usually about a personality formed amid trauma, who then, amid trauma and having very poor attachment. So we heard a bit about mothers and their effect on dysfunction. It's usually about poor attachment, which is the very early stages of how an infant bonds with usually maternal figure, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a paternal figure, it could be another relative. That's absolutely critical with how we connect with others for the rest of our lives. And if that's disrupted, it affects us in a whole range of ways, such as not being, and critically, how we regulate. The term is affect, but essentially you can think of that as emotion, how we regulate emotions. So think of it as a toddler. You don't get a lolly and people scream, kids scream. From a very young age, we actually learn how when things don't quite go our way, we learn to tolerate that and regulate that emotion. The very idea of personality disorder is that regulation is disrupted, and it happens in a range of ways. But very commonly in women, it's this borderline personality. It's a very common predictor of violence, and likewise for men, this personality disorder. So all these issues. There's another term called attribution. So again, often related to personality disorder, and it's whether we attribute things internally when something goes wrong, or whether we attribute it externally. And you'll know many of you would have seen lots of people like that, where whenever things go wrong, people are like, well, that they did it to me, or this thing did it to me. And they don't feel in control of their life. They're constant. It's that idea of learned helplessness, like a kind of boat on choppy waters being thrust around, that things keep happening to them and they just don't know why. And that's really about attribution. And that's another key contributor to possible violence. Where something goes wrong or you feel a negative emotion and you think it's intolerable and you attribute it to someone. They go, hang on, I can't tolerate this. I want to put it's yours. It's your fault, essentially. These are all the variety of reasons for domestic violence. Now, what else does the research show? And again, it's something I see clinically. One, while men commit violence in families for not dissimilar reasons, they might commit violence elsewhere. Women commit it quite differently. So they're far less likely to be violent in non-family settings. But within family settings, they are much more likely to be violent and possibly equally violent. You know, we all know the research suggests the possibility of that. But they will do it differently. So the very idea of violence is really about where we have an emotional arousal. We get some sort of primitive arousal. And then balancing that is what we call cognitive inhibition. So I know it was Vernon, he's gone now, he was talking about this sort of stop. Do men have a greater ability to stop? In some respects, they may do. So again, violence is all about, does your cognitive inhibition, is that able to stifle or moderate your emotional arousal? And all these disorders I've spoken about limit your ability towards cognitive inhibition. They limit it. And hence you're more likely to be violent. For women, they're more likely to be violent to their kids. They're more likely to use weapons. And they're not necessarily, one of the myths was that it was always defensive. That's certainly not what the evidence shows. The other things we know, and I think these are a couple of really critical points I want to make. One is, as a psychiatrist, you work on individuals. Individuals present. The theories around domestic violence have largely been social. They've really been driven by social researchers. Hence, it's been this idea of patriarchy and male privilege, which are really social theories. Yet, increasingly, one of the shifts, I guess, if you, in terms of your battle and my battle, is really you need to shift the focus from social research to individuals. That individuals commit violence, and they do so for a variety of reasons. So that's really psychology versus, so Paul, he also has a similar background, and so do many of you. So in some ways the battle is partly about psychology versus social theories. That's one of the battles. The other battle is about gender versus relationships. Certainly my experience and what a lot of the evidence shows is that domestic violence is often, it's a relationships issue. It's really about how can you help partners, how can you help families. So if you look at it through relationships and family systems theory, it's actually far more explanatory than if you look at it purely through gender theories. Gender theories are not explanatory for domestic violence. Relationships and family systems theory are more explanatory. So then suddenly if we look at it through a relationships issue, where we're actually trying to help two people, and it's usually violence is an outcrop. It's kind of the froth on the top. It's the dramatic froth on the top of an already turbulent, problematic relationship. And that's what we forget. And often when you see couples where this is going on, it is just one of the many of the issues that you're actually dealing with. It's rare that that's actually what they've come in. It's not what they would say is even the main problem. So again, we need to look at it. So two critical points. It needs to be seen through individuals and individual psychology. And it needs to be seen through relationships and not gender theory. I think as part of your battle, there are some key shifts that I think need to be made. And then obviously that broader focus on children. How does it affect children? Exactly how I've just spoken about attachment, about regulating affect, regulating emotion, about being able to connect and communicate distress appropriately. If you grow up in an environment where there is domestic violence or other types of abuse, and we've heard a bit about sexual abuse, which is probably the most damaging, but even verbal abuse, what it does is it sets up internal symptoms where you adapt, but in unhealthy ways. You learn that in that environment, you cannot communicate distress in healthy ways. I can't openly communicate about something I'm upset about or assert myself, try and express my needs in a healthy way. You learn that you can't do that. So that's how your personality is formed thereafter. So suddenly when you're a teenager, that's when you start self-harming or acting out or hitting someone or trying to limit your emotions through drugs and substance abuse. That's how it affects children and the broader family system. And that's another key part of the debate that that's often missing in these discussions. And it's critical that we bring them back to the forefront. So look, I've spoken about, I guess, some key, what I think it's part of this story is about. One, it is about the story of men and the story of gender. It is partly about that. But then, at a deeper level, domestic violence is fundamentally about individual psychology. But it's expressed through the story of men and gender. But I'm warning you that we need to reframe it away from gender and as individuals and individual psychology and away from social theory. And likewise, we need to reframe it away from, with greater focus on relationships. And you look, I think it's a very tough battle, as all of you know. I certainly, it's impossible not to be interested in this issue if you are working in mental health, because it's very common presentations, be it whether you see in prisons, as an outpatient, or working in the country. So it's impossible not to have an interest in this, and I find it extraordinary, for example, that. Well, I don't find it extraordinary. I understand now, but it's clearly a battle. I have sympathy now for Paul. I remember beforehand when Paul was saying that he felt he actually needed to provoke to some extent, because dispassionate data was not going to win the debate here. And I think he's right. So there needs to be this combination of the intellectual, but also the political and the emotional in some respects. And, it's a very tough battle. But look, I congratulate all of you for being involved in this and helping, not just men, you're helping women, you're helping in relationships, and you're helping children. That's what you're doing. And fundamentally, the family is the unit of society. So through that, this is a critical movement to help society, through greater social awareness. So I applaud you, and I hope my experience can be useful, and I'll certainly continue to contribute where I can. And it'd be great to field some questions or comments now, and go ahead.
That was a wonderful talk, Doctor. Thank you. Your idea about separating gender and going into individual cases, I guess you're trying to make the separation. And I'm just curious, a really popular theory that's out there in the feminist group is something called white male privilege theory, right? And one of the ideas is that when people are raised in privilege, they develop a superior complex. And as opposed to people who are not raised in privilege, they have an inferior complex. So people with the superior complex, when things don't work out for them, what they do is they feel they have a right to bring other people down, right? Whereas people with inferior complex, they only bring themselves down, right? For example, so we've seen a number of cases in the United States where we've had mass shootings, And even recently, the German pilot who crashed the airplane, right? And so they're relating this to, these people. These are mostly white people who were raised in privilege, and so instead of them just taking themselves down, they're taking a whole group of people down. And then you have people with inferior complex, like the black community. There's also a lot of violence there, but they just individually shoot, one or two people and themselves. Do you think there's any credence to that theory, or is it totally?
Well, as I've learnt, the more I've looked into this area, there are a host of theories that have absolutely no evidence. That it's entirely dogma. There's no evidence that male privilege or ideas around patriarchy or superiority complex, there's just no evidence for that. So they're basically broad brushstrokes that effectively feminism or sections of the community have pushed. There's no question that you can have, say, narcissistic men or personality disordered men who have very poor empathy, who attribute all blame outside of themselves. You can have women also. So that's not usually a function necessarily of superiority or inferiority complexes. It's more a function of personality disorder. So I guess my response to that is that there's very little evidence. There's certainly theories, and there's politics, and there's views that anecdotally might suggest that, but there's very little evidence, be it statistical or in sort of peer-reviewed research, where that would remotely comes up. Does that answer your question? You don't look entirely satisfied.
It does. Just that is a real, that theory is really a central theory of the feminist
absolutely
movement. It's like it's what they revolve around, right? And so separating that, taking gender theory into individual theory, I think that's a really big task.
Yeah.
But do you think there is a logical way to make that differentiation?
Look, I think one simple way.
Because there's just so much support.
Yeah. Look, I think strategically, one thing I think, I think this broader idea of patriarchy, male privilege, etc., even before domestic violence, you can strongly argue that the idea of male advantage is increasingly bogus, right? So in almost all these markers, much like this would allude to, particularly amongst working class, ethnic groups, rural men, middle class men are still they're doing okay. They've adapted to sort of change gender roles to some extent. But I think the first argument is that the idea of entrenched male advantage is simply bogus. And you don't even need to look at domestic violence to argue that, right? So that on its own challenges the ideas of patriarchy and superiority complex. But then the reason domestic violence is essentially the last bastion, and it's the most emotional and the most heated and the most dramatic aspects of gender relations, and in turn feminist theory. And that's why really it's almost like they're backed into a corner, and this is what they've got to hold on to more than anything else. And it's almost like rabid kind of. Yeah. So it's really, without feminist theory as the key predictor of domestic violence, there's virtually no feminism. So you can see why there's so much invested in that narrative, even in spite of little or no evidence supporting it.
Hi, Dr. Ahmed. Well, you just said a lot there. And I wanted to start by saying that not only am I a survivor of a lot of this as a child, I'm an adult child, I'm a survivor of all of this. I've spoken to people on 6 continents, real everyday people of every ethnic group. English is a second language, people from Africa, parts of Europe, Australia, the United States, Canada, you name a big part of the English-speaking world. I've talked to survivors of domestic violence and child abuse from every continent. You just described how domestic violence works better than any doctor I've ever heard to say it. And really, you just described it better than anybody. any
thank you,
doctor
Dean.
I've ever heard.
I appreciate that.
Because that's how it really works. Okay. Now, this gentleman already kind of asked the question, but I'll push it from a psychiatric perspective or a medical perspective. You're really saying that you think this idea of privilege and loss of privilege is not even useful, let alone valid. Is that pretty much you're saying?
Exactly. I don't think it's not explanatory, nor is it useful. I think the male experience of a degree of turbulence, if you like, or more trying to come to terms with changed roles, I think that is useful. That is useful.
Sure.
But that doesn't automatically overlap with them feeling some sort of entitlement or automatic privilege. That's my point. There's certainly a role, what I'd call a role diffusion, and again, I'm referring, I mean, even just Paul and I talking last night, some of this came up. This idea, arguably, that men had almost more fixed, as equally fixed roles. Possibly we have more fixed roles from a social point of view than women do. So women are expected to adapt, hold multiple roles, but arguably men are almost taught to have more fixed roles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that takes us out of the realm and into ideological issues. I would tend to agree with that. Even today, we haven't loosened the rules like we have for men. But I guess I just had one more other question, and otherwise that'll be it. You mentioned in your speech that you were almost mystified by the pushback you got. Now, I wasn't when I saw it. This has been going on a while, actually.
I'm confident that people in this room weren't mystified.
I wish the feminists could be friends with us about this, but they've said for years, the decades, they will not. Too bad. They've chosen it and whatever. And that's a real shame. But you mentioned being shocked because nobody you worked with clinical thought you were saying anything radical. And I'm running into more of this personally because of what I do. I keep running into social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists who find nothing weird about what I say. Like it totally fits with what they see. And yet I go out publicly and I say this, and the hate is extraordinary. I actually wonder, though, are we seeing a change in the younger people? Actually, I'm going to ask you a rude question. How old are you?
40.
You're 40. Okay, you're still a young man then. And you came up young watching this. I'm finding people under 30 especially are very open-minded. I don't know if you've observed something like that or not. I'm just curious if you have.
Look, I think there's certainly a lot more open-minded around gender roles. No question. Look, again, I can't say for sure. I think they're more likely to be open-minded, yes. I think they're more... Look, my view, just more broadly on politics, a lot of people were shaped, a lot of people's views on politics, particularly those in power now, certainly in Australia, and I suspect much of the Western world, their fires were lit, if you like, and they were shaped through the 70s, right? So depending on what sides they took, be it Thatcher, be it social liberation, be it all these different issues, economic and social, many people were shaped through that period. So they still hold on to a lot of ideas about, who's a victim and who's not, and the way the world order is. And a point I did make in my talk, which I think was another reason that I was, if not unique, but it had a factor in the blowback, that because I wasn't a middle-aged, angry white man, it was slightly more threatening. It was slightly more threatening that you're a man you're a psychiatrist, but also you're from an ethnic group. Like I'm from effectively poverty. I'm of Bangladeshi background. My parents are from Bangladeshi villages. So there was a sense that certainly, especially in sections of, say, feminism and the left more generally, there's this sense that, hang on, you're a victim. Well, you're meant to be. And it didn't fit onto, how dare you're a traitor. You're a traitor. That's how it... So it wasn't just a white ribbon. It wasn't just that I was a traitor to feminism, but more generally I was a traitor to ideas of the left, in some respects. So that's why the blowback was possibly magnified. From more broadly, yes, I think as people who weren't forged through a particular stage of politics that is critical to the 20th century and how the world is now, as they start rising to positions of power, my hope is that they will be a bit more flexible on many of those issues. You're welcome.
Any other questions?
So I certainly thank you for your presentation and the fact that you're speaking out about these issues, especially since they seem very non-controversial in the scientific and medical community. So one thing I'm wondering is, there's the original focus when domestic violence was brought up as a major issue was violence against women, violence against women, violence against women. But I think we're kind of agreeing that a real aspect of this is the way it creates a dysfunctional family and inevitably harms children and then repeats the cycle. And then you have more individual cases of dysfunctional persons. So I'm wondering, why is the medical community not coming out in full force? Because the media is kind of against them in the sense that it's not the thing that generates the most controversy to come out with the bare bones scientific facts. But why aren't they, from a public advocacy point of view, more of people like you within the medical community really advocating for children and, not wanting to see them turn into these dysfunctional people later in life with all these problems?
Look, again, I don't think the medical community necessarily has ownership of this sort of issue. It's quite such a broad issue because it overlaps with a whole range. It's such an interdisciplinary issue. I think that's made it hard for any particular advocates to kind of own it, if you like. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So as a doctor, for example, I can see individual victims and think of their psychological issues and advocate for them. It doesn't automatically give me license because I think domestic violence is still fundamentally seen in terms of social theory. Right? It's still seen sociologically. That's why I think it's hard for individual advocates to break through that. That's one of the other thing. I think most of when domestic violence is reported in the news, they will usually be fairly extreme cases, usually involving women, and there's no question, that clearly exists. So that again, that magnifies how people perceive it, because the most violent, not always, mind you. I mean, there's more and more cases around women, and most of you would have seen that Time magazine article which profiled the US goalkeeper that attacked, I think it was a sister and a nephew. But within that article, and I encourage you to read it if you haven't read it, it's called The Surprising Truth About Family Violence. And I was impressed to see that in a major magazine. And it spoke very much about some pretty serious cases around women. But again, I think, it's politics. It's just an issue where the politics is entrenched. And people have too much to lose if you're in positions of power to come up against it. So it hasn't been... It's one of the last sort of civil rights, trying to think, say, from a racial point of view, it's still part of that broader spectrum, be it race, women. These are certain victims, if you like, in the broader... And nobody, not nobody, but I don't think it's got to a stage where there's a critical mass, or it's shift. I think it will shift, and you guys are part of that. But I think there's still too much to lose for a lot of people. But I mean, look, at the same time, I think it's, one piece of just observing, say, some of the, what is it, Senate? Is that the Senate? No. I think it may be excessive to argue that men and women are equally affected. So I know just seeing some of the promotions around the conference. I think, yes, self-reports in certain studies say they might have equal experience, but I think you certainly... Look, it may be true. I think it's unlikely, but you're not going to garner... I think you'll lose the public if you're attempting to argue that men and women are equally affected. I think that's unlikely. That's my view. So there's still certain ways that I think you can frame it, and I think just the broader issue of there are male victims. They need to have a place. They need to have a space that they can even express that vulnerability. It's part of a broader paradigm of upheaval in masculinity, and there are a host of other male issues that overlap with that. I guess strategically, that's the way I think of it. So I think if you're almost too forthright and you're saying, well, no, men and women are equally affected, I think that's a bridge too far. Possibly. I mean, I'll be interested what Attila thinks there. But look, more broadly for you, all these issues, it's all political. So the academic research often doesn't get published. The dramatic examples are usually women in the press. There's enormous blowback. There's just not much to gain for a lot of people in positions of power to come out for this issue. That's my impression. Again, I'm very new to this. I'm a rookie in this scene. These are some broad observations that I'm seeing. Yep.
I just wanted to ask about pretty much what you were leading to just then, but with the political spectrum and getting research, like anything that we talk about as a group or as individuals, but with an interest in domestic violence and talking about male victims, is going to rely on better research. Now, in Australia, if people don't mind me talking locally for a minute there, but I think it was in 2006, there was a big lot of research being undertaken on men's issues and men's experience of violence, and it was shut down with a change of government. And it was all leading to showing, I don't want to say a positive outcome, but it was all demonstrating the high number of men's experience with domestic violence, but the issues and the impacts that they were facing. What do we need to do politically to get something like that reinstated? What are our chances of being able to achieve that? Where do we go? Where do we start?
Look, I guess, again, strategically, I think you have a better chance focusing on these broader decline in male indicators in general, but that being the door to things like domestic violence. So I think there is a growing interest in this kind of thing, right? Just this broad decline in male function right across the board, be it educational outcomes, mental health outcomes, suicide, and the Stanford professor Zimbardo talks about, and something I see very much, where men are increasingly lacking a role. He's talking about young men losing themselves in pornography and gaming. So this is the next generation we're talking about, where it's like the demand that they don't see a role for themselves in society. They're essentially hiding from, if not hiding, the world's too demanding for them, they can't see a role, and they're particularly attracted or particularly prone to getting lost in the internet world of pornography and gaming. I bring that, again, as part of a broader system that the upheaval that we're currently experiencing, men, for a wide variety of reasons, are being disproportionately affected. So my argument would be that domestic violence needs to be incorporated as part of that bigger picture argument. It's almost too emotional and too sensitive to be, I mean, again, I don't know, but it seems to be, if you look at it narrowly, it's just seen as a don't touch thing.
Don't you think, though, that when we talk about, we talk about men's issues like, loss of work, loss of social identity, family identity, that conversation seems to always lead to the fact that men are violent, as opposed to, men being raising awareness for men as victims.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm probably not experienced enough in this issue. Like, I don't see why it should. Because if men are increasingly powerless in the household, if women are more dominant in the household, and certainly the evidence, and I know the evidence doesn't necessarily hold sway in these debates, shows that that's far more likely to be a predictor of potential female violence towards men. Again, some of this, I can't say for sure. I don't have the answers there. But I just think a broader advocacy of men's issues, again, this is the last bastion of it all, because it's the most sensitive, it arouses the most emotion, but it's almost like the more you fight for the other men's issues, at least my hope is that starts getting chipped